Welcome to the annual checkup, taking the pulse of the Supreme Court, presented at Norwalk's Wall Street Theater. Please welcome the President and CEO of Planned Parenthood of Southern New England, Amanda Skinner.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the annual checkup. We have a great program for you tonight and are so glad you have chosen to spend your time with us this evening. Whether we gather in person or virtually, events like tonight are truly a team effort. I want to thank our host committee volunteers who gave their time and energy to help bring us together. I also want to thank our generous event sponsors whose support makes a special evening like this possible. A special thank you also goes to our staff who worked so hard in preparation for tonight. And once again, I want to express my appreciation to all of you for joining us this evening. You are our partners in ensuring access to high-quality healthcare, education, and advocacy to advance equity and protect the fundamental right to sexual health and reproductive freedom for all. Thank you. I also want to take a moment to recognize the passing earlier this year of one of our most vibrant champions, Simone Joyaux. A renowned nonprofit leader, fundraiser, and champion for equity and justice, Simone was a fearless warrior for expanding healthcare to all people. She had a truly generous spirit and an uncanny power to inspire support for Planned Parenthood. Simone was my collaborator and friend, and I miss her dearly. Her powerful legacy lives on in our fight to protect sexual and reproductive freedom. Please join me in a moment of silence to honor Simone. We need heroes and champions like Simone more than ever because America is in an abortion crisis. 2021 is the worst year for abortion access since 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided. Nearly 600 abortion restrictions have been introduced this year alone across 47 states. While many won't pass into law, 83 abortion restrictions and 10 bans have been adopted, preventing patients across the country from getting the care they need. Among these new laws is an abortion ban in Texas that went into effect on September 1st. This law bans abortion at 6 weeks gestation before most people know they're pregnant, virtually outlawing abortion in the second largest state in the country. It also deputizes any private citizen to act as an abortion bounty hunter, rewarding neighbors, abusive partners, and even complete strangers with $10,000 for each successful lawsuit brought against someone who helps a patient obtain an abortion. Now, politicians in Florida, South Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, Missouri, and other states are following Texas's playbook. The U.S. Supreme Court has also failed to protect patients. In a 5-4 ruling, the court allowed the Texas ban to go into effect, and on October 22nd, again let the law remain in effect, while agreeing to hear appeals last week on November 1st. We are still waiting to hear a ruling on those appeals, but the rulings leading up to those hearings, allowing a blatantly unconstitutional abortion ban to go forward and harming thousands of people who were denied access to care, foreshadowed what we can expect from the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court. In tonight's program, we're taking the pulse of the Supreme Court to examine the critical role it will play in the coming months regarding aborting access. In December, the court will hear Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization to determine the constitutionality of Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. This is the first challenge to the settled case law of Roe v. Wade that the court will hear since the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her replacement by Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The future of Roe is more uncertain than it has been in a generation. There is a very real possibility that it will be overturned, paving the way for dozens of states to either outlaw abortion or make it nearly impossible to attain. This is a truly red alert moment for reproductive freedom. With all that hangs in the balance at the Supreme Court, we are grateful that the protections afforded by Roe have been codified into state law in both Connecticut and Rhode Island. While abortion is legal in our 2 states, we know that legal rights are the bare minimum. They are the floor, not the ceiling. A legal right without true access to care is meaningless. And there are too many people in our own communities in Rhode Island and Connecticut who face countless barriers to accessing care. Thanks to you, our supporters, we are able to work on changing that reality. You help us ensure that our health center doors stay open and that people have the knowledge and information they need to make good decisions for their own health and well-being. And you make it possible for PPS&E to act in coalition with partners across our 2 states to identify and address systemic barriers through policy and advocacy work. Now more than ever, we need to speak up and take action. The time is now, and the urgency is real. Our work in Connecticut and Rhode Island to provide healthcare, education, and advocacy is just as critical as the work being done in Texas and Mississippi. As Dr. Martin Luther King once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. The challenges to Roe in Texas and Mississippi will not stay in those states. But likewise, as we improve access to abortion and strengthen healthcare and education here, those ripple effects will have a positive impact across the nation. This year, we're being joined by several special guests. And because there's so much to discuss, I'm going to jump right in. In addition to being a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and New York Times Supreme Court correspondent, our first guest, Linda Greenhouse, is also a senior research scholar and lecturer at the Yale Law School. She has written widely about the law and politics of abortion. And her latest book, Justice on the Brink, The Death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, The Rise of Amy Coney Barrett, and 12 Months That Transformed the Supreme Court, is being released today. The day after SB 8 took effect in Texas, Linda sat down with our own Chief Operating Officer, Zari Watkins, to talk about the impact of what is taking place in today's Supreme Court.
Thank you for the introduction, Amanda. Linda, I'm so excited for our time here together today, and we want to thank you for all your support here at Planned Parenthood in Southern New England. Due to our pandemic conditions, we wanted to be in the health center, but unfortunately that's not possible. So we instead are modeling our public health safety practices for vaccinated folks, and we're here in the beautiful Study Hotel in downtown New Haven. So before we get started, I guess we can take the mask off since we're safe. And Linda, I have a burning question for you. What do you think about my t-shirt?
RVG. So what I think, in addition to nostalgia, is the thought that if she were still with us, there'd still be abortions being done in Texas.
Yeah, that's for sure.
I mean, it's pound for pound. And Amy Coney Barrett sitting in RBG's seat made the difference here. So your shirt kind of says it all in a very sad way.
You know, I didn't realize how much of an impact that she had until she passed. And especially being here at Planned Parenthood and doing the work that we're doing, it seemed really timely and appropriate to just have her here with us today for our time together.
Okay, I wish you were here.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so much going on in the courts right now related to access to abortion. And I know that you've covered a great amount of the changes in the Supreme Court and how it's impacted Planned Parenthood. Actually, I think your book, Justice on the Brink, is coming out today. Is that right?
Yes, it's right. I'll give the full title. The main title is Justice on the Brink, The Death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, The Rise of Amy Coney Barrett, and 12 Months That Transformed the Supreme Court. It's a month-by-month chronicle of the first term of the court with the 3 Trump justices. And, you know, it's brought us, what happened in Texas is just after my frame, because I go July to July 2020 to July 2021. So this is just after my frame, but it's certainly foreordained by the things that we saw happening during the term.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, you know, that prompts my first question. What do you think about how all of this has on the concept of expanding the Supreme Court?
Well, certainly people who are pushing for what generally is called court reform, court expansion, court packing, are motivated by what happened in 2016 when Mitch McConnell, Republican Majority Leader of the Senate, captured the Scalia vacancy and prevented President Obama from filling it. So, filled with Neil Gorsuch, he's one of the 5 votes to not intervene in Texas. The next vacancy, Justice Kennedy, filled with Brett Kavanaugh. And then the norm-breaking nomination of Amy Barrett before Ruth Ginsburg was even buried. Her funeral had not taken place when President Trump showed up with her in the Rose Garden, what became a super spreader COVID event. to announce her nomination. So it was just, these were a series of head-snapping events that brought us to what we see unfolding now.
We colloquially talk about the Mississippi case, but for the viewers who are not as familiar, can you talk some more about Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization and kind of where we are with the Mississippi case?
Yeah, so the Mississippi case is really an example of the impact of the Trump justices on the Supreme Court, because the appeals court that covers Mississippi, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, of course had struck down this Mississippi law which bans abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Of course they struck it down because the law of abortion for almost half a century, going back to Roe against Wade in 1973, reaffirmed by Planned Parenthood against Casey in 1992, was that a woman has an absolute right to terminate a pre-viability pregnancy. So we know viability is 23 weeks, maybe 24 weeks, not 15 weeks. And so the law is flagrantly unconstitutional under current law. The Fifth Circuit struck it down. A past Supreme Court, I'm here to say, would not have bothered to take the appeal. Why take the appeal? The law is clear. However, after long consideration, months of inside the black box of where the justices sit when they are deciding, a figurative black box, where the justices sit when they're deciding what to add to the agenda, granted the Mississippi case. So Mississippi initially came to the Supreme Court saying, you don't have to overturn Roe and Casey. Don't worry about that. You just have to uphold our law. That made absolutely no sense because of what I said a minute ago. There's an absolute right to abortion pre-viability. That's been a safety firewall preserving the right to abortion against all these efforts in the red states to try to do this, that, and the other thing to block access.
Right.
Once that firewall is breached, which is what the question is in this case, it's hard to see what the stopping point is. And of course, what's weird about the conjunction of the Mississippi case and the Texas situation is we already see around that corner. Yes. Texas has banned abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, and they've gotten away with it, thanks to the Supreme Court. And so we already see in effect, the real world answer to the Mississippi case. It's just a bizarre confluence of events. I say bizarre, but many people, and I think they're quite right, say inevitable, given where we've been going.
Thank you for that great synopsis of both the Texas and the Mississippi case. I want to dig a little deeper and talk some more about the Texas case. As it pertains to this Texas abortion ban, have you ever seen any type of sue thy neighbor law like this before?
Well, in a way, we've seen it in fascist countries. We've seen it in East Germany under Stasi. Turning every neighbor into a snoop and a snitch. And here it's even worse, because anyone who successfully sues an abortion provider or anybody who's given any kind of assistance to effecting the right to abortion can get at least $10,000. That's not a cap, that's a floor.
Yeah, it's a
at least
bounty.
$10,000 and an injunction to stop that provider, person, entity, whatever, from continuing to do the activity. So it's unspeakable. There's never been anything like this in the United States. As the Chief Justice says in his opinion, dissenting from the court's refusal to intervene. There's no precedent for it in this country. There's plenty of precedent around the world, and probably Margaret Atwood, in her wildest dreams, could have thought of something like this.
And it's interesting to me, at first glance, and without going too far down the rabbit hole on legal standing, but my initial impression was that, with this Texas abortion ban, maybe we shouldn't be as worried about it, because how do these private citizens have the standing to bring an action against another when they can't even show any harm to themselves?
Well, of course, in federal court, they would have absolutely no standing. That's clear.
Right.
So this law relegates all this to state courts, and they're not governed by the jurisdictional rules of the federal courts. And Texas Right to Life has a website up that provides a form that just lets neighbors say, I have reason to think there's an abortion going on, or I have reason to think that somebody helped somebody get an abortion, and fill out this form and send it in.
Wow.
So, there you go.
It's mind-boggling, seriously.
And I'll just say something else about it. I've been thinking a lot about a wonderful OBGYN named Jane Hodgson. Perhaps people may recognize that name. She's no longer alive. She was an OBGYN in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And back in the early 70s, she had a patient who presented with German measles, which in those days there was no immunization against German measles, and it was known in early pregnancy to have a devastating effect on a developing fetus. And so Dr. Hodgson said to this patient, I'd like to make a test case out of your case. And abortion's illegal. This is before Roe. Abortion's illegal, but I would like to, if you so desire, terminate this pregnancy and be public about it, because I want to challenge the law. So the woman agreed, had the abortion, and Dr. Hodgson called the police and said, come and get me. And they did. And she was prosecuted, and she was convicted. And she would have gone to prison, except the court decided Roe against Wade.
Wow.
That intervened. You might think in a dream world, the Texas medical profession would rise up and say, we can't put up with this. But the Texas medical profession is that very same that was refusing to give hospital admitting privileges to doctors who perform abortions. And that led to Whole Woman's Health, the 2016 case, back in a golden age when the court did the right thing. So the medical establishment of Texas is going to be no help on this, until it comes for them, right? Yeah. This is not the last chapter. This may be as Winston Churchill once said, this is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it may perhaps, Winston Churchill said at the beginning of World War II, be the end of the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know we're talking about kind of the immediate impact. And I also think about a little bit longer term and the Mississippi case. And what do you think the Mississippi case might do, or how do you think it'll impact next year's midterm elections?
Right. So let me say something about the Mississippi case that I think is an important point to make. The fact of banning abortions at 15 weeks is not going to have a major impact on abortion practice in the state of Mississippi, because as I understand it, there's one clinic in the state, just one, Jackson Women's Health, the plaintiff in this case, and they only provide abortions up to 16 weeks. So the facts of the case are not really what matters. What matters is, as I said earlier, is breaching that firewall of viability. And you asked what impact this is going to have on the 2022 election cycle. It really depends on whether the public understands what game is afoot. It's really incumbent on the media, and it doesn't have to be the, quote, pro-choice media, just the media willing to unpack the game that's being played here and explain it to people. And of course, in a way, the Texas situation helps that, because it's just visible what's happening in Texas. The cutoff at 6 weeks, as I understand it, will deprive 85% of the of the population of Texas from access to abortion, because 6 weeks is 2 weeks after somebody misses their period.
You wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even know you were pregnant.
For most people, certainly young people whose periods are irregular, older people, premenopausal whose periods are irregular, it's just a joke to think that you can be sure that you're pregnant, sure enough to get yourself not only to an abortion provider in Texas, but they've got mandatory counseling, they've got a waiting period, they've got all kinds of hoops. It's not like PPSNE, where somebody can decide they need to terminate a pregnancy and can make an appointment and
walk through the door.
That's
right.
It takes days of travel and planning, and many, if not most, women who have abortions already have children at home. They need childcare. They have jobs. So any obstacle, let alone a humongous one like this, is a real problem for on the ground where people live. And
sure.
That's what we're dealing with.
I think about, our minority and underserved communities, and we already know how challenging it is, especially during the pandemic, and how these communities are impacted, and how access to care has already, or lack of access to care, I should say, has already reared its ugly head. And just to think that we're in a space where we're diminishing access to care even more, it's really heartbreaking.
Of course, and every day somebody's another day pregnant. It's not like, well, I can, I just called for my annual mammogram appointment and I expected to be able to get it in November and I couldn't get it till January. All right, so I'll get a mammogram in January instead of November. But you can't play around with the calendar when the clock is ticking and you're pregnant.
No, it's true. This brings us to a great segue, because you mentioned PPSNE, and in Connecticut and Rhode Island, Roe versus Wade is essentially codified into our state laws. And so we do not experience the challenges in these states that are experienced in Texas and Mississippi. What impact do you see in terms of abortion, traveling for abortions and being a safe haven for abortion care? How do you think other states like Connecticut and Rhode Island will be impacted?
Well, I think we've got to grow an infrastructure of support for women in these states. I mean, just speaking personally, I donate money to one of the organizations that helps women in a state far away, a state I've never been to, find their way to the single provider in that state. So I hope, to the extent that, there's philanthropical willingness to pitch in on this, that may be what's happening. I mean, we're devolving into two countries. One country where our constitutional right is respected, and one country where we've just been relegated through the exercise of, quote, law, to a state of nature. That's what it is, a state of nature where your neighbors are spying on you and trying to get in line ahead of each other to get the $10,000 bounty. And really, it's just unthinkable, and we've got to find a way to help.
Fun fact, 2021 is tied with 1973 for the year with the second most enacted abortion restrictions ever. The restrictions of forcing people, as we mentioned, to travel long distances and have to navigate waiting periods and take time off work and pay out-of-pocket expenses. Many of these women don't have the resources to even do the things that they're going to need to do to get abortion care, all while dealing with this pandemic. And I think you brought up a great point. How are we moving forward in time but backwards in progress on reproductive freedom?
Well, it's all about religion. And, religion is the last taboo in polite society. I mean, you and I could talk about, gender and sexuality and race and all kinds of things. But, heaven forfend that we sit and talk about religion. But the 5 justices in the majority here are Catholic. Now, Neil Gorsuch worships as an Episcopalian, but he had a Jesuit education. He and Brett Kavanaugh went to the same Jesuit boys' private school.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And they are carrying out a religious mission. And in the state of Texas, Texas has been taken over by the Christian right. We know from polling ever since before Roe against Wade, a majority of people in this country want there to be a right to abortion. So we have a minority have have taken over this issue and used the levers of political power and now judicial power to overcome the will of the majority. And it's a huge threat to our notions that we all were raised with of democracy.
I'm hoping that Roe v. Wade won't be overturned given all that's going on in the courts right now. But we know that the direction that we're heading in indicates that there will be some change, whether it's via the Texas abortion ban or whether it's via the Mississippi case. From your understanding, what are the possible ways that Roe might evolve or devolve in the next year or so?
Well, I think the important thing is this viability question.
Right.
Roe gives the absolute right to abortion before viability. So that's the thread of both the Texas law and the Mississippi law in the Dobbs case. And, other things that are kicking around in the lower courts. For instance, several states have banned abortion for a diagnosis of Down syndrome. Now, that's a very, very cynical thing to do because, as we know now, a large majority of Down syndrome fetuses are aborted. Why? Because the state, the government, offers no support to these families. So we've got these states claiming that they're pro-life. But once you're born, and once you're born into a family that will be struggling for years and decades to give you the proper care, the state could care less. But these so-called eugenic laws, which is really a loaded word, is what they come under, are spreading rapidly, kind of under the radar because people are uncomfortable talking about them. But I could see, Justice Clarence Thomas has already announced that he'd like to see such a case and he would vote to uphold such a ban. So, we know that's one vote, and, can they count to 5 based on what the court did in Texas? Maybe so.
How do we make up ground going forward, given what we're dealing with?
Politics. The only thing we can do is fight it in politics. We've got to mobilize young people. We've got to work in the states. The state of Texas is under this control of this, rabid minority. We know they don't speak for the general population of Texas, and we've got to find a way to throw these people out through the democratic process that they have perverted.
I feel particularly like we're climbing up a hill, given that, on one end we're dealing with this pandemic, and on the other end we're trying to fight all of these actual abortion bans. And it seems like we're battling 2 fires with one hose. So in addition to voting, what more can we do?
Well, we've got to get sex education in the schools. We've got to get contraception availability everywhere. These states that preach against abortion don't provide sex education, have never made the connection between preventing pregnancy and ending pregnancy. So there's a kind of an agenda of social goods that would serve the end of reproductive rights if we can mobilize and get this message out there.
For sure. And it doesn't hurt, to, have generous supporters like yourself who are willing to, take a little bit out of their pocket to help all of these initiatives and support all of these women who don't have the means to get a timely abortion, to support the contraception education, and get the word out about how this is impacting folks, and the fact that we need to vote and we need to be loud and boastful in our voice against what's happening. And I just want to thank you for spending time with us this morning. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for letting me vent and rant. It's been therapeutically useful for me, and best wishes for a great outcome to the gala, and it's been a pleasure for me to talk with you.
Thank you, and likewise. I appreciate our time today.
The Supreme Court often feels very removed from our everyday lives, but we know that their decisions impact the health and well-being of our families, our communities, and ourselves. Now I'd like to take a moment and have a brief conversation with somebody who has seen the firsthand what happens when abortion access is denied. Dr. Timothy Spurrell has been PPS&E's medical director for many years and also has spent many years flying to Texas to provide abortions there. He has seen the impact of other restrictions in the past. Dr. Spurrell, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, Dr. Spurrell, as an abortion provider yourself, can you just tell me a little bit about how you're experiencing this moment?
Well, there's a little bit of deja vu for me. So I live in Rhode Island, but I've been going to Texas since 2013. And in 2013, 2015, somewhere in there, there was another law that was tried to be pushed through. It was called HB2, House Bill 2. So House Bill 2 just made it difficult to get an abortion. You needed admitting privileges close to a hospital. I lost my admitting privileges during that time. It wasn't because I had complications, because I didn't have complications. It was because I didn't have complications. They had no way to evaluate me, so they let me go. And that's how crazy Texas can be. HB2 didn't get put into effect. It was overturned. And in the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, and I'm gonna paraphrase, she said, the law was simply just to make it harder to get an abortion. So now if we go to SB 8, SB 8, it's been devastating in Texas. It's essentially a ban on abortion. So it's like HB2, right? So HB2 was meant to make it harder to get an abortion. But the difference between HB2 and SB 8 is SB 8 also introduces a fear factor, and it causes trepidation. Everyone's afraid of litigation. And that's what this law was meant to do. It was meant to create fear. So, and it's not just fear in patients, and the patients are petrified. It's in doctors, CEOs, donors, staff, everyone. So it's essentially just a ban on abortion. By the time someone knows that they're pregnant, it's often too late. And we're seeing just so fewer patients right now. It's been very difficult.
That must be so hard to be an abortion provider, having to talk to patients and know that you might be turning them away from care.
Oh, it is. It's impossible. At one place where I work in Texas, it was so devastating for staff, Amanda. They've developed shifts.
Oh.
So it's one person's job to tell somebody that they can't get care because it's so emotionally devastating for one person to do. So they switch off. Yeah. It's that bad.
Thank you, Dr. Spurrell. I know, as somebody who is working directly in those communities, and as somebody who provides abortions for us here in Connecticut and Rhode Island, this hits you really personally too. So thinking of that, we know that abortion is legal in Rhode Island and in Connecticut, but we also know that it's not fully accessible to everybody here. So how do these laws go beyond just being a Texas problem?
Well, so I went to Texas, Amanda, because I wanted to kind of get out of my comfort zone. I wanted to do more. And I'm super glad I went to Texas, and I'm super glad that I'm in Texas. But I didn't really understand, when I went to Texas, how different it can be from other states. So forget what's in SB 8 or HB2 for a second. A normal part of abortion care in Texas is I have to tell women they could get breast cancer from an abortion. It's that nuts.
And that's not true, right?
Oh, of course that's not true. Of course it's not true.
Right.
Not true at all. And it's one of a number of things that I have to tell them that are not true.
Right.
It's that crazy.
Yeah.
So my fear is, this is so hard to say. But the moment that we've all feared is, rapidly upon us, if not already upon us.
Right.
In 2021, there's been 106 laws enacted that are anti-choice already.
Right.
It's the most number of laws since Roe v. Wade went in effect, and it's the first time we've seen triple digits in these kind of things. So they're not going to stop.
Right.
They're just not going to stop. And the thing about it is, we think Texas is Texas. It's not. Texas is just one example of what's going to happen, what I fear is going to happen. Abortion will become bi-coastal, North Carolina to Maine, California to Washington, maybe Minnesota, maybe Illinois, and the rest of that geography is going to be anti-choice. So for me, I want to be counted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is the time, right?
Right. Right.
And if
This
it's
is
not
the time.
super close to that time, the way that we see patients, and you and I know this, Amanda, it could change dramatically. And when I say by counted, should Roe v. Wade be overturned, should all these things that we fear could happen, it's going to fundamentally change PPSNE, because we're not going to stand and watch, right?
That's right.
That's nuts. We're going to help, because that's what we do. You know, we're care no matter what, and we live that.
Right. Right.
So what we do is going to change.
Yep.
And we can't do it without support. So I know that most people watching this have already made a gift, but I'm hoping that tonight you'll consider making an additional gift to ensure that PPSNE, that we don't stop providing care, that we're prepared for the future, that we're going to be a major provider for all those that can't get care. One of our donors from Rhode Island, Pat Fuller, she's agreed to match gifts tonight up to $50,000. So your gift, it's going to have twice the impact, and we need it. So this is how you make an additional gift. If you're watching on a computer, you'll see a donate button in the upper right corner of your screen. And if you're on your phone, it's down at the bottom. You can click on these buttons to make a gift right now, or you can use your phone to make a gift via text. And here's how you do that. You open up a new text. You'll want to send it to the number 41444. 41444. And in the body of the text message, type PPSNE, then a space, then your gift amount, then a space, type your name in, and then hit send. After that, you'll receive a text. It's going to include a link about your donation, and you can watch your donation appear on the screen. I can't thank everyone enough for being ardent supporters of PPSNE and being counted at this time. It really, really matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spurrell. Thanks for being with us this evening. And thank you for everything that you do.
You're welcome. Thank you.
At PPSNE, we believe sexual and reproductive rights are basic human rights. Our work as a healthcare provider, educator, and advocate must also continue to address barriers that impact people's ability to access their full potential of health. For years, we have seen and heard of the impacts that systemic racism and other forms of oppression have on a person's economic status, where they live, their access to health care, and more. We center health equity in our work at PPSNE because legal rights are meaningless without the ability to exercise them. Our next guest is here to help us understand these challenges better and what we can do to address them. I'm honored to introduce activist, educator, and writer Brittany Packneck-Cunningham. Brittany is an NBC News and MSNBC contributor and host of the weekly podcast Undistracted with Brittany Packneck-Cunningham, where she focuses on today's issues through the lens of intersectional feminism. She is a former elementary teacher, education executive, and fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics. She is also working on a forthcoming book entitled We Are Like Those Who Dream. Welcome, Brittany. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
It's so great to see you. And I love your on-brand top. And yes, it's awesome. Thank you. And I'm so excited
I had
for
to
this.
come in pink. for
Yes.
my Planned Parenthood family. Yeah, solidarity all day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you and am so happy to be able to talk to somebody that I have followed and learned from and looked up to as soon as you came on my radar.
That's
So,
so kind. Thank you.
well, thank you. So we're going to dive in. We are at a critical moment, and we are facing the most significant threat to reproductive rights, to access to abortion that we have seen in decades. And we have been talking about what's happening with SB 8 in Texas, with the coming Mississippi case that the Supreme Court is hearing on December 1st. And I think sometimes it's easy for folks to think that that's a Texas issue or a Mississippi issue, when in fact, we know that there are people in our own communities who struggle to access basic health care. We know that while abortion is legal here in Connecticut and Rhode Island, it's not fully accessible to all people. And people face a range of obstacles in living their own healthiest lives. And I'm wondering, beyond outright bans, what do you see as some of the most pervasive barriers that impact people's ability to be as healthy as they can be and to live lives where they have true agency over themselves?
Well, that word that you said at the end is really the key to all of this. It's agency. It's about bodily autonomy and agency. Irrespective of what the choices are that you make about your body, you should be able to make those choices. It's interesting. The day after SB 8 passed in Texas, I think like many of you all, I was on a lot of calls that day and, was on a massive organizing Zoom with a number of incredible organizations who do work on reproductive justice and reproductive rights, just like Planned Parenthood does. And in a year and a half of being forced to use Zoom, this was actually the first time that I'd ever experienced what we now call the Zoom bomb, right? Somebody who was not invited to the call, forcing their way into the call. And it was a group of people who identified as men who were deeply racist and sexist in their engagement before we quickly got off the call. But it was fascinating to me that in 18, 19 months of being on Zooms about racial justice and police violence and all of the other things that we've been dealing with during this global crisis, that the one time I personally experienced a Zoom bomb was when women, femmes, and gender nonconforming people came together to demand that we are treated like human beings. And that is deeply telling, right? So we know that there are lots of mechanisms that the status quo in society uses to limit our ability to have agency and autonomy. Most certainly, it is abortion bans and all of the places across the country in which abortion is legal in name only. But it is also about making sure that folks don't have access to all of the kind of health care that Planned Parenthood provides all of the time. It's about limiting access to birth control. It's about forcing people of certain ages to have to consult their parents, or instituting wait times before one can actually have an abortion. There are a number of ways in which we see this manifest, and the truth of the matter is, what happens to one of us happens to all of us. So if it's happening in Texas, it's happening to me in DC, it's happening to you all in Connecticut, it's happening to folks in Kentucky and Missouri. Certainly, we know that there's another case coming up in Mississippi. All of these are test cases, right? This is about making sure that they figure out how to get the precise kind of language on the books that can be protected at the federal court level. So they've stacked the courts at all levels. We certainly see at the Supreme Court level, and they've been working and tweaking just the right language to make sure that they can flat out deny the kind of constitutional rights that should be guaranteed to all of us. So it's not, if it's happening to Texas in a moral and spiritual way, it's happening to all of us. As original activist Lilla Watson said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you know our fates are bound up with one another's, then let us work together. So clearly we're all tied together in this human destiny. So in a moral way, it is happening to all of us. And in a literal and material way, it is happening to all of us. Because the desire is to spread what has happened in Texas to Mississippi and my home state of Missouri, to Connecticut, to DC, to California. The goal is to make sure that it's never limited to just one state and just one region. So we have to stay on our toes about all of this and never ever think that just because it's happening far away from me, that it's not happening to me.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. One of the things that I found myself thinking about, particularly in this moment, given everything you've just said, is where can we look for examples of truly intersectional movements that worked? Because I think people feel sometimes that urgency is overwhelming, and they're not seeing examples of clearly in front of them. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but they may not be fully visible to all people, where intersectional movements or cross-movement allyships have really driven the kind of change we want to see. I don't know if there are some examples you can cite, or experiences you've had where you've seen that really come to fruition in the way that the group wanted it to.
So I'm thinking of a couple of examples. All of these are still in movement, in progress, right? So, the wins are both big and small, and some of them are yet to come. I'm thinking very clearly of the Poor People's Campaign under the leadership of Reverend William Barber. He talks often about fusion politics, about understanding that poor white folks in Appalachia and poor Black folks in Mississippi have common interests. So how do we make sure that those folks come together across lines of difference and build solutions that work for all of them, knowing full well that those lines of difference should not be rendered invisible, that once again, the solution should be measured against how the most marginalized will be affected by the solution. And the Poor People's Campaign, I think, is an incredible vision of what it looks like for the most marginalized to truly be in leadership. What you don't have is a very well-heeled, wealthy, singular organization or person who is the face of that movement. You've got chapters and organizing happening in all of the places that so many organizations have forgotten about. And they are making their voices heard on Capitol Hill. They are pushing this White House. Even when you have so-called friends in the White House, they need to be held accountable as well. And I think that they're a really good display of what that fusion politics can look like. I'm also thinking about climate justice activists, and especially young climate justice activists. Now, this is not to say that any of the movements I'm naming have been perfect, and plenty of them have had internal criticism about issues of equity. So I'm not holding any of these up as some kind of perfect paragon of what intersectionality and diversity can look like. But what I am saying is that we've got pieces and wins and best practices that we can pull from all of these places. One of the things I really appreciate about this really diverse cadre of climate justice warriors is, first, they're global. They understand that this is not just an American issue, that it is an issue that affects the entire globe, that it particularly affects the global South, and the voices at the forefront need to be representative of the fact that if the planet is dying, then everybody on the planet should care. I'm also thinking specifically about the fact that climate justice activists have made sure, once again, to hold everybody in all political parties accountable. When you look at the ways that climate justice activists, young ones, really transformed the Biden agenda during the campaign, a lot of that was transformative. And now that they feel like the Biden White House is not upholding their end of the bargain, they are keeping their promise to put the pressure on and keep the pressure on to make sure that those promises are met. And so having the courage to comfort the afflicted and convict the comfortable is something that we can all learn from. lastly, I really think that we have the opportunity once again to come back to the work that reproductive justice organizers of color, particularly Black women, femmes, and gender nonconforming people, have been doing for a very long time. Because what is really happening is that there is a policy fight always, but there's always a level of deep community care. I look at Jama Birthing Center, which is a place in my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri, where they train Black doulas, they develop Black doulas, and they create an entire network of reproductive health and justice for birthing people and pregnant people across the city of St. Louis that need it. Often those folks are coming without having the capacity to be able to afford the services that the wealthy get, and yet they're treated with full dignity and given the best services possible. Those kinds of communities of care that we create on our own, in our own communities, with our own skills, with our own networks, with our own funding, with our own institutions and our own resources, those matter deeply. It is not to say that policy shouldn't be creating those for us. It is to say that the urgency and immediacy has to come in the fact that materially people need that support right now. And so I think, have the opportunity to learn from a number of organizers of color who've been saying we can push on the policy front and give people the material care that they need right here and right now.
Thank you so much. And actually, that is such a perfect lead-in to another question I wanted to ask you, because I've been thinking a lot about if we want transformational change to happen, we have to think about the grassroots, the grass tops. We need to think about local. We need to think about nationwide, global. But we also need to think, we get very caught up sometimes, I think, in thinking about policy as the only lever of transformational change. And a thing that has been on my mind is the power of storytelling. And I was at an event this weekend, and we had abortion storytellers sharing their story. And it was one of the most impactful rallies I've been to hear people sharing their stories, people of all genders on the spectrum, people of all races and ethnicities, people who had all different reasons for having their abortions. And you have, I watched an interview that you had with Soledad O'Brien, I think a few months back, where you were talking about being an activist who chooses to engage with the media. And that also flagged for me this power of changing the narrative. And could you talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling, of narrative, of the conversation to actually influence transformational systems change?
So I've been an activist my whole life. A lot of people came to know me through my activism during the Ferguson uprising and things, kind of around 2014 to 2015, but I've really been doing this my whole life. I spent 10 years working in education, and last year decided very intentionally to start to move my career to be specific, toward media and building our own storytelling tables. And I did that with great intention. So I'm an activist for life. The platform may change, but the orientation toward justice never will. And in fact, I'm trying to build the platforms for the sake of justice. And I did that in part because all the way back in 2014, I just remember being on the streets of Ferguson, fighting for our lives in the middle of residential neighborhoods where children were supposed to be, having birthday parties and barbecues and cookouts and going to school the next day. And none of that could happen because we were essentially under police occupation for weeks. And I would turn on the news and I would turn on the radio and I would watch and listen to people tell the story all wrong. And when they did that, often they were leaving out the voices of those who were most deeply involved, particularly Mike Brown's family members, members of the Canfield community, the young people who were there day in and day out, taking on the police who were instigating violence. The police were instigating violence every single day. They were often leaving out the voices that mattered. And often the story and the narrative that was being constructed was one that upheld a white supremacist status quo without question. That most anchors and producers and news leaders and newsmakers we're deciding to use Ferguson as an example of something that they use to confirm their own bias, right? Their own bias against Black folks, against poor folks, against young people, against Black men, against Black women. So I'm sitting here watching all of this. And during that time, a number of us started doing a number of things to try to push back against that. We started the Ferguson Protester newsletter, which ended up having a worldwide distribution of tens of thousands of people. We'd wake up at 3 and 4 every morning and collect the few articles that were telling the story correctly, and the tweets and the vines and the videos that were coming directly from the ground to make sure that we could construct the narrative in a way that mainstream news was not. I started ghostwriting these Ferguson protester letters, right? That I would consult with folks literally on the street and say, what do you want the world to know? And we would put together language directly from people and send them out at first completely anonymously, because we wanted people to hear directly from us without being under the restrictions of a mainstream media narrative. And some of those lessons really stuck with me, because we often give away the power that we each innately have to tell our own story and to help tell the stories of our communities. And so this shift to media for me was not just about getting a seat at the table of existing media platforms to be a voice that's often not heard on an MSNBC or at a BET, but to actually start to build my own table. So I work with a collective of women and femmes called The Meteor. Last year, we launched, in the middle of a pandemic, a podcast called Undistracted, which I'm incredibly proud of, because we look at the news through an intersectional feminist lens. And we talk about news and justice every single week. And we get to decide what and who makes it on air, who we platform, what ideas we present as legitimate, and how we inform people of the things that they're not hearing from other places. And I tell that story, it's personal to me, but it really is universal for those of us whose stories, whose voices, whose lived experiences have been relegated to the shadows. It is more important, in my opinion, now more than ever, to make sure that we are building and constructing our own storytelling tables wherever we possibly can, whether that looks like a podcast, a web series, online news, mainstream news, whether that looks like storytelling circles and book clubs, whether that looks like groups of organizers, people that you may go to dinner with twice a month to exchange those stories and elevate and amplify one another, whether it looks like social media or new media, whatever it looks like. Those storytelling tables are the places where our truth can be upheld unequivocally and without restriction. It is so important, for example, for us to have seen my hometown Congresswoman, Cori Bush, tell her story of abortion on the Congress floor, right, in a congressional hearing chamber. Because when we tell these stories, we normalize a medical procedure, this factoid that 1 in 4 women have had or will have an abortion, and that and love someone who has or will have an abortion, needs a human face to it, right? The factoid is one thing, the story is another. The story is what sticks. So listening to her talk about the painstaking decision that she had to make, the fact that she was not cavalier about it, the fact that it was deeply personal to her and that she's choosing to open this up, it normalized a medical procedure and it humanized the once pregnant people who have decided to have an abortion. Because it is easy to vilify those that we don't see as human. But when we tell our stories, it's a lot harder to see us as demons. It's a lot harder to see us as villains. Telling those stories also give other people permission to have agency over our own bodies. Because when we tell our story, when we hear someone else tell their story, it lets us know that we are okay, that we are whole, that we are human, and that we are allowed to make this choice. That kind of storytelling cannot be underestimated. And it's something that we have to be willing to do at all levels, right? And in all ways. And I want to be very clear. if you have decided to tell your story, have not decided to tell your story, it doesn't make you more right or more wrong than anyone else. It is a deeply personal decision. But what is very clear to me is that whatever your story is about reproductive justice, reproductive health care, or abortion, they need to be told once you are comfortable, because this world is going to continue to construct a narrative for us if we don't control it for ourselves.
I could not agree with you more. And one of the things that you're making me think about is, to me, so much of this is about people being able to connect into love. And you said, everybody knows or loves somebody who has had or will have an abortion. I feel like we're Kismet spirits. That's something I say a lot. And on your website, on your homepage, you have a quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and it says, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." And I feel personally that if we could tap into our human love for each other and our capacity for love, that is a place where people can enter into this. And even if it's just at that personal moment of recognizing that someone you love has experienced this, whether it's an abortion or another injustice, right? So you featured that so prominently on your website. Can you talk about what that means to you, and why is that something that drives you?
I love that quote because what he does is help us reshape and redefine our understanding and therefore our ownership of love and power together.
Right.
Before the part that you read, he talks about people often seeing love as anemic rather, and what does he say? Sentimental, right? So it is this soft kind of fuzzy thing that doesn't really mean anything. And he says that we often envision power as reckless because so often the people and things that we identify with having power are things and people that have harmed us, right? But he says if we actually redefine the contours of this, we recognize that power is something that we each innately have. And I love this idea, especially as people from marginalized backgrounds, to not run away from power, but to embrace power, to say, I want to be as powerful as possible. And guess what? Me being as powerful as possible should never mean that somebody else is powerless. That I want to have power, I want to share power instead of hoard power, then that is an orientation that really can empower all of us to build the kind of change that we deserve to see. And that when that power is informed by love, that it can actually be an unstoppable force to change the world. Dr. Cornel West said that love, justice is what love looks like in public. Yeah. And I also love that notion because what would love look like wrapped up in policy? Mm-hmm. It would look like bodily autonomy and agency. What would love look like in policy? It would look like reproductive justice such that women of color are not dying disproportionately when they have children. What would love look like wrapped up in policy? It would look like a care economy that actually allows families, if they choose to have children, to take care of those children once they are here with nutritious foods and a real, genuine social support system, good housing, good education, clean air, and clean water. What does love look like wrapped up in policy? It looks like true public safety that invests in the people instead of over polices people from the top down and actually creates violence in communities instead of protects people from violence. What does love look like wrapped up in policy? It looks like real climate justice. Love wrapped up in policy looks like all of the things that help us not just to survive, but to thrive. And I always find it interesting. You can always tell what an issue is by who stands for it, and you can always tell who people are by who their friends are. And I always find it really interesting that the same folks who fight for access to abortion and the same folks who fight for reproductive justice are the same folks fighting for climate justice, are the same folks pushing back against police violence. They're the same people fighting for racial liberation. They're the same people fighting for the care economy. They're the same people fighting for a livable wage. They're the same people fighting to abolish jails and prisons. It's the same people. who want to see love wrapped up in policy, who want to actually design a world where, again, not only can we survive, but we can thrive because love is the policy. And instead of us thinking that that makes us soft or that that doesn't make us legitimate in the political sphere, we can use that love to inform our collective power and set policy that actually loves on people. I believe that that is what we have within our grasp. I believe that that is what we can accomplish if we actually move forward in an intersectional and in a thoughtful, in a loving and powerful way. So that's why that quote is so central to me, because it informs really my life's work. It informs my personal motto and mantra and mindset, because I don't ever want to be powerless. I want to be deeply powerful, and I want to share whatever power I have with other people so that they can tap into their own power. And I want to inform the power that I know I got with as much love as I can find, to make sure that every single person around me and every single person across the world for me is actually leading a thriving life.
Brittany, I am feeling overwhelmed with love for you right now.
I feel it back.
I hope you do, and so grateful to have had time with you today. And I know we're coming up on the close of our time, and I also feel fired up, and I'm sure that the people who are listening to our conversation feel fired up too, and feel ready to go transform the world with love. So I guess my last question to you is, what can they do? They are supporters of our work here at Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. They want to wrap the world up in love. They want to see a different, better world that is more just and equitable for all people. What can they do? What else can they do? Do you have any suggestions?
So Mariame Kaba talks about moments like these leading you, letting them radicalize you instead of leading you to moments of despair. And it echoes, of course, the sentiments of the great John Lewis in a particular way that helps us remember that the times that feel most down, the times that feel most desperate, that's the moments that feel like we are under the greatest assault and attack, like this one, like the day RBG died, like the day, like that election day in 2016, that these are the moments to lick our wounds, to pick ourselves back up, and to keep fighting. True love, radical love, is relentless. It never, ever, ever gives up. Even if that means you have to go take a rest, make sure that you're in community with somebody that you can tap in to keep fighting. And then when they need to sit down, they tap you in. So the work never stops, even if you take a pause. There is, I believe, a unique opportunity in this moment for us to really build upon what we know is majority public support for access to abortion and for Roe versus Wade, and really for bodily agency. There is an opportunity in front of us to not just create a policy shift, but to create a cultural shift where people are not afraid to say the word abortion, where people do not go back to arguments that we know actually harm the work, where we actually embrace all pregnant and birthing people and their rights toward reproductive justice, their right to be treated as human beings with dignity, and where we expand the cultural conversation to understand abortion as a common medical procedure, one that affects every single person on this planet, one that should be safe and accessible and affordable for all people. It is just as much about swinging the policy zeitgeist as it is about swinging the cultural conversation. So while you are volunteering and donating and supporting and amplifying Planned Parenthood, which you should be doing, be in community with other people who don't quite get it. Be a storyteller. Be a person who's unafraid to say the word abortion around them. Help normalize exactly what we're talking about. Help humanize exactly what we're talking about. When you see other people bravely standing up to tell their stories, give them love and shine the light on them. Share their stories far and wide. Share your story far and wide if you are comfortable to, and make sure that at the end of the day, you do not choose despair, because that is precisely what the opposition would like for us to do. Real love tells the truth, and real love is relentless, and that has to be our work.
Well, I think real love tells the truth, and real love has to be relentless, is where we should close this conversation. Brittany, it has been an incredible honor to talk with you today. I'm so inspired by you. I feel like the world is in good hands with you in it. Brittany, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
It is literally the very least I can do. So I'm deeply grateful for the time and space.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for spending the evening with us to take the pulse of the Supreme Court. I especially want to thank our special guests, Linda Greenhouse, Dr. Timothy Spurrell, and Brittany Packnack-Cunningham, for joining us and sharing their insights. Despite the challenges we face, this is not a moment to be discouraged. On the contrary, the work that lies before us should energize and invigorate us. History is with us, and we are adding a new chapter with our efforts that our descendants will be able to draw inspiration and courage from. We can do this vital work at PPS&E because of so many wonderful supporters like you. If you'd like to help us make an even greater impact across Connecticut and Rhode Island, you can use the donate buttons located right here on our event page to make an additional gift to support our work. And a special thank you to Pat Fuller for her very generous matching gift, doubling the impact of all gifts made during this event up to $50,000. I hope by next fall we'll be able to be together in person. But until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good night.